Is a bad leader good or a good leader bad? This might have felt like a nonsense question, but today we're going to begin our look at a person in the Bible who kind of exemplifies this exact question and therefore teaches us a lot about God's grace and how it works through his people. This is Eric Slawick, aka the UWM Pen Guy, and this is the Bible Commentary. As always, if you like what you're seeing, I would just ask that you hit like and subscribe so that we can help the channel grow. Now, without further ado, let's get into the Word. So, we're continuing the leadership study today, and we're going to look today at the life of Samson. Now, Samson is an interesting character. He is probably the least likely person to expect in Hebrews 11, which I'll put up now. But there he is by name. The Spirit himself gives testimony that Samson not only was a born-again, saved, regenerated man, but he actually was a man whose life exemplified a consistent faith in God. So the question that one always has about Samson is, how is this possible? Because you're naturally, if you were just going to read this account, then you would almost automatically assume that Samson was probably like we saw with King Saul, a hypocrite who went through his life seeking after his own personal desires and basically wasting every opportunity he was given and ending ignominiously. Except that ending part gives us the beginning of a clue as to the difference between Samson and Saul that is even present in his story in the Old Testament. Now, I hope to get to that point later, but for now I'll say that Samson's ending is as seemingly bewildering as his beginning or his middle. And specifically, it's kind of a victory through defeat that's also a victory. And I will hopefully explain more about that in the next one or two videos. But for now, let's return to the ideas of leadership, and we'll say that Samson, in the note of ultimate irony, is an example of leadership by character. Now, a parallel to this can be found in the life of Lot, which I believe I've alluded to a couple of times in this Joshua 1 series. And the Apostle Peter much later says that Lot was a righteous man who was tormented in his soul by the evil deeds that the people around him were doing. But if you go back to Genesis, you will see nothing but failure on the part of Lot. There are a few debatable points where Lot may be seen to be a regenerated person. The first of them is actually the beginning of Lot's story, where you see Lot actually go along with Abraham, and the description is pretty much indistinguishable in many ways from the description that Abraham himself receives. And that would be surprising because by chapter 13, their paths very much diverge. In fact, chapter 13, we see where, interpreting this in light of Peter's later commentary upon Lot's story, we know that this is where what Paul would call the carnal believer diverges from the spiritual believer. And to be clear, this is not a matter of superiority and inferiority. We're not talking about a situation like we have with the apostles where on several occasions, which I'll put up here, up to and including the very Last Supper of the Lord itself, they're actually engaged in the most childish, petty, ridiculous kind of fighting you can imagine, where they're actually trying to measure themselves, as Paul would say, measure themselves by themselves and see who's greatest in the kingdom. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about carnal and spiritual believers. When Paul refers to a carnal believer, he's referring to what the earlier part of Hebrews 6 also refers to when it talks about someone who is genuinely born again, but essentially hasn't moved beyond the basic forms that were present in Judaism at that time. Now, the reason for this was because in Judaism you had a basic ceremonial kind of legalism or works-based salvation and holding to man-made regulations and traditions apart from spiritual realities and spiritual life. Now, a carnal believer or a basic believer is one who is still kind of stuck in these forms and shadows and symbols and hasn't moved on to the substance in Christ. Now, this can also describe a completely false, hypocritical believer, which is why the lines of spiritual condition can be so blurry and difficult to distinguish. People who look to that which is on the outside rather than on the inside can fall into either one of these categories. And Lot was simply the more secular or pagan equivalent to this. So Lot was kind of a perpetual carnal believer, although I think since James would say that he says, show me your faith and I will show you my faith by my works. There can't be zero growth from genuine good soil. There has to be some sort of harvest and some sort of growth. I think Lot just experienced the extreme of what is actually possible for a genuine believer in terms of that growth being hindered. So I would argue that Samson is very much in the same category, albeit more growth occurred for Samson than for Lot. This reality makes it incredibly shocking that Samson would be an example of leadership by character, but he is. Because that part of his character and his walking by faith that was sincere and consistent was sincere and consistent. Now, obviously, David that we saw previously has a much better record, a much better testimony concerning his works than Samson did. But we saw that the result for David for his stumblings was catastrophic. Absolutely catastrophic. And he brought turmoil to the entire nation. Where with Samson, we will see that his stumblings were sort of limited to himself in their immediate implications, except insofar as a lack of positive can be seen as a negative. In other words, Samson had much, much greater potential than he actually achieved under God with the gift of supernatural strength and fighting ability that he had been given connected to his Nazirite vow. But it's interesting that I would argue, because there was no institutionalization of Samson's office as judge or deliverer, that therefore there wasn't really the potential for the whole nation to be dragged up and down and up and down and up and down like would be the case with monarchy. However, to circle this back around again, I do believe that in spiritual leadership today, it's much more impact, is more on the monarchy side of impact than the judge side. I think good spiritual leadership today, if you look at the New Testament requirements for an elder, which I'll put up here, then you see that character is vital. And you have in this list that the person be the husband of one wife. So, which literally is a one-woman man, meaning no adultery, no divorce, no fornication is permissible, or you're disqualified from being an elder. I guess fornication is a tricky question, but if I were involved in selecting a pastor for a church, I wouldn't take any chances. And I think in any spiritual leadership, that kind of stumbling, the exact kind of stumbling that Samson experienced, is the exact kind of stumbling that will probably destroy a person's credibility for spiritual leadership. Now, what we learned from Samson's story is that God can work through that to accomplish ends and means anyways. But I don't think that anyone would look to Samson in the way they would look to David, given that, in essence, the character is reversed here, where David's sinful failings were the exception to the rule, where Samson's victorious righteousness was the exception to the rule. So, next time I will get into Samson as a typology or an allegory or an image of Christ. And until then, this is Eric Slawick, aka the UW1 Pen Guy, and this has been the Bible Commentary.